Today, we will learn and reflect on slavery in the ancient world. Slaves were the employees of the ancient world. Scholars estimate that perhaps a third of the population of ancient Athens were slaves, and for ancient Rome, scholars think that well over half of the population at the height of the Roman Empire were slaves. You may ask, how can we benefit when we ponder the history of slavery in the ancient world? Well, slavery was such an integral part of these ancient cultures that we cannot truly understand their history and culture unless we appreciate the role slavery played. We are tempted to view slavery as something that went away with the Civil War, that with regards to slavery, the modern world is so morally superior to the ancient world, since we no longer buy and sell slaves like we buy and sell cattle. But we must ask ourselves, is someone who earns starvation wages, is someone who earns only the minimum wage, truly free? At the end of our talk, we will discuss the sources we use for this video and the blogs that cover this topic. Please, we welcome interesting questions in the comments below. Sometimes these generate short videos of their own. Let us learn and reflect together. Slavery in the ancient world was not based solely on race like it was in the Confederate South before the Civil War. When a city was defeated, the women and children were often enslaved, the men were often slaughtered, although sometimes the men were enslaved to work in the mines, which was itself a death sentence. In this video, we will examine slaves in ancient Greece and Rome. In a companion video, we will examine slavery in the Bible and ancient Judah and Israel. People in the ancient world were also enslaved when they were captured by pirates, which is what happened to the Cynic philosopher Diogenes of Sinope, who was sold to Xeniades of Corinth, where he helped raise his sons, teaching them Cynic philosophy and becoming part of the family. Also in the Odyssey, the father of Odysseus, Laertes, purchased the loyal swineherd Eumaeus, who helped Odysseus battle the suitors from pirates. And before he was emperor, Julius Caesar himself was captured by pirates, although he was ransomed rather than enslaved. Famously, Caesar told the pirates he was more important than they imagined, and that they should ask for more ransom, and that he would return and crucify them after he was ransomed. These foolish pirates thought Caesar was joking. Also, in the ancient world, if you could not pay your bills, you could be sold or sell yourself into slavery. One example of this is Hosea's wife in the Old Testament, which we will examine in our companion video. Though the customs and laws regarding slavery varied from culture to culture, all slave societies shared some general characteristics, mainly that slaves at best were treated as second-class citizens, but were usually not seen as quite human. Slaves were often treated as if they were talking livestock, even in the ancient world. Here we have the categories of slaves in roughly the order of their severity of their mistreatment. Although there were kind masters in both ancient and modern times, far more often masters were cruel rather than kind to their slaves. And we see the first category as household servants and slaves that helped on the small farms. In both ancient and modern times, domestic slaves were considered the most fortunate of slaves. Rarely were they worked to death. In ancient Greece, domestic slaves or servants could truly be a member of the family, or what Greeks called the oikos. When a Greek family acquired a new slave, there would be a religious rite inducting the slave as a formal member of their oikos. In both Greece and Rome, slaves could help raise the children. Often they were wet nurses. Sometimes they were teachers. Sometimes they accompanied the boys to the city square or agora in Greece, where teachers often held classes. In Rome, Greek slaves were the most highly prized slaves. Many were skilled artisans and teachers. Quite close personal bonds would form between the child and their wet nurse. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus returned home disguised as a beggar, it was his wet nurse slave who first recognized him. Slaves also did many other chores. Since women in Greece rarely left the house, the slaves did all the daily shopping for food at the market. They helped with the cooking and the gardening, and the female slaves helped with the spinning. Since slaves were considered property, they had no rights, although often household slaves or more independent slaves were permitted to have a family. There were few, if any, mentions in Greek or Roman histories where a slave family was split up and young children resold, as was common in the Upper South in the period before the Civil War. Masters could beat or abuse their slaves or even kill them, and there was nothing the slaves could do to prevent this. Professor Garland tells a sad story of a pretty girl slave who was regularly beaten by her mistress because she suspected that her husband was forcing his way upon her. In ancient Greece and Rome, slaves had limited, if any, access to the judicial system, primitive as it was, since they were an inferior class. For example, the Athenian courts only admitted testimony from slaves when it was compelled through torture. The next class of slaves are concubines, both consenting and unwilling, often captured in war. Quite often, slaves were sold naked so the buyer could examine the property and know exactly what he was purchasing. In every slave society, ancient and modern, the women were often forced to be concubines. And in the brutal slave society of the Deep South, they were forced to breed like horses and cattle, as Frederick Douglass describes in his slave autobiography. Our thumbnail pictures Queen Andromache of Troy, who her husband Hector worried would be enslaved as a concubine if the Greeks burned Troy, which was her eventual fate, as we heard in our lecture on the Iliad. The Iliad itself was the story of warriors arguing over concubines captured during the Trojan War. We also have a video comparing the concubines captured in the Iliad to the passages in the Torah prescribing the proper treatment of concubines captured during war by Israeli soldiers. The Torah dictates that these concubines should be treated as legitimate wives, a far higher status than concubines enjoyed anywhere else in the ancient world. The least numerous and probably the most fortunate class of slaves were those who lived apart, often with their wives and children. These were the tradesmen. Often they were allowed to retain some proceeds from their trade and eventually buy their freedom. This type of slave was less common in the Deep South, more common in ancient Greece and Rome. These slaves were the most valuable slaves. They performed all the work that the Athenian and Roman citizens thought were beneath them, such as blacksmiths, craftsmen, artisans, tanners, managers of shops and factories, and even captains of trading ships. They paid their owner a commission on what they earned. There were also freedmen working as skilled workers. Some of them freed slaves, some of them were foreign workers. And another class were the slaves who worked for the city or state or in factories. These included the slaves who were owned by the city-states, including Athens. These slaves were the ancient equivalent of civil service, and they were somewhat independent, especially those who were court and other government officials or clerks. In Rome, the work crews who worked on the roads, aqueducts, and other infrastructure were slaves. Maybe they also lived in the barracks. We are just not quite sure. The most numerous were the field hands for large plantations. Since the slave owner had minimal contact with these slaves, their lives could be quite harsh. McGuckin noticed that many Roman POWs were enslaved to work the large, ancient Roman plantations, feeding Rome. The slaves who worked on the plantation farms worked in more brutal conditions than the household slaves. The mostly male slaves lived in barracks. The Roman slaves usually slept in leg irons. The ancient sources don't mention how the Greek plantation slaves were restrained or how many there were. These slaves were not allowed to marry or have any sort of family life. They were worked like draft animals. Like the slaves who worked on the mines and quarries, they likely worked very long hours and often back-breaking work. And the worst category of all is the slaves who worked in the mines of the ancient world. In both ancient and modern times, the slaves who worked under the worst conditions were the slaves who worked in the mines and quarries. These mines were often a death sentence. After the Athenian defeat in the Sicilian expedition in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenian men were enslaved to work in the mines of Sicily. None of these slaves made their way back to Athens. Most probably only lived for a few years. We also have a passing reference by Thucydides that Nicias rented 1,000 or so slaves to Athens to work in the mine. In recent history, in Soviet Russia, the worst gulag camp was the Kolyma gold mine in western Siberia. Few sent there survived the cold and the damp. In the ancient world, the slaves working stone quarries were slightly better off. At least they did not have to work in dark shafts with oil lamps. But accidents were frequent and fatal in both mines and quarries. How many slaves were there? Some scholars estimate in ancient Greece as many as 1 in 3 people were slaves. Many were born into slavery. We do know that slavery was the basis of Athenian democracy, giving owners time to participate in the many government assemblies and juries. And the Spartan helot slaves enabled the Spartans to be full-time warriors. And we'll discuss the Spartan slaves in another specialized video on Sparta. But in emergencies, slaves would fight side by side with their masters. Herodotus informs us that a large portion of the armies fighting the Persians were slaves, who were likely granted their freedom if they survived the battle. A higher percentage of Romans were slaves because so many were enslaved in the wars of conquest by the Roman emperors. Julius Caesar may have enslaved as many as 500,000 people during his wars in Gaul, which is France today. Unlike the Greeks, who rarely paid their domestic slaves, it was far more common for Roman domestic slaves to earn a small wage so they could eventually save enough to purchase their freedom. This policy helped pacify the Roman slaves, and since the Romans had more slaves, the Romans had a problem with slave rebellions that happened on occasion, like the one led by Spartacus, played by Kirk Douglas, of course. Former slaves in Roman society were not totally free. As former slaves, their former masters were now their patrons, and they owed a few days of labor each year to their former masters, and if they ran afoul of the law, their freedom could be revoked. The taint of once being enslaved was not inherited. The children of free slaves were truly free. There were many freed slaves in ancient Rome. Some became quite wealthy. And at least one freed slave became a Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, who himself was a former slave of a former slave. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus lands in Ithaca, the goddess Athena disguises him as a beggar, and he first visits his trusted slave, Eumaeus, the swineherd. The father of Eumaeus was a king of an island near Syria, we are told in the Odyssey. But he was tricked and sold into slavery by pirates. And he was purchased by Laertes, father of Odysseus. In the Odyssey, Eumaeus stands with Odysseus and his son while they slay the suitors, holding his wife Penelope hostage. But was Odysseus so grateful for Eumaeus risking his life to fight these suitors against overwhelming odds that he offered to free him from slavery? The Odyssey does not say that this thought ever entered the mind of Odysseus or Homer. We have sparse evidence what it was actually like to be a slave or servant in the ancient world. We have no surviving slave autobiographies from the ancient world. We have a hard time imagining what it was actually like living as a servant trapped and in servitude. Recently, the Atlantic magazine published an article, My Family Slave, which told the story of a Filipino servant and relates some of the human dilemmas involved. And I think this account would help us understand how domestic slavery worked in the ancient world. Most Filipinos are paid a small wage and are often permitted to attend school and eventually start a life of their own, as the many comments to the article by other Filipino servants suggest. But the lady servant in this article was not paid any wages, so she was treated worse than most Filipino servants. The author states, "She lived with us for 56 years. She raised me and my siblings without pay. I was 11, a typical American kid, before I realized who she was. Her name was Eudocius Tomas Pulido. We called her Lola. Lola is a term in Filipino for grandmother. Lola was 4'11", with mocha brown skin and almond eyes that I can still see looking into mine, my first memory. She was 18 years old when my grandfather gave her to my mother as a gift, and when my family moved to the United States, we brought her with us. No other word but slave encompassed the life she lived. Her days began before anyone else woke up and ended after we went to bed. She prepared 3 meals a day, cleaned the house, waited on my parents, and took care of my 4 siblings and me. My parents never paid her, and they scolded her constantly. She wasn't kept in leg irons, but she might as well have been. So many nights on my way to the bathroom, I'd spot her sleeping in a corner, slumped against a mound of laundry, her fingers clutching a garment she was in the middle of folding. Not having a room to call her own and sleeping in the hall and the laundry's behavior I've read about for Greek slaves in the ancient world. Part of the reason Lola was not given an allowance in the early years was that the entire household was scraping by. The husband was not paid well by the consulate after he moved to America. Eventually, he abandoned the family, and the mother had to go to school and earn a living as a single mother. And Lola had to shoulder more and more family responsibilities, raising the kids. Lola became more and more of a confidant to the mother. They would complain and commiserate over the father who had abandoned them. They would joke together. And when the mother remarried, Lola even stood up to the new husband when he started to abuse the mother. Lola taught herself how to read, but her situation had robbed her of all self-confidence. The kids, when they became teenagers, eventually browbeat the mother into treating her a little bit better, giving her her own room, and permitting her an allowance. Finally, when the author's mother died, he told Lola that she no longer had to work, but Lola insisted. But near the end of her life, the author traveled with her to the Philippines so she could visit her living relatives. This is a very sad story of what it was like to be a household servant. Lola was both part of the family, but also apart from the family, much like the household slaves in ancient Greece and Rome. Now, regarding the sources for this video, we of course have the Iliad and the Odyssey. They have brief accounts of slaves, what it was like to be a slave in the ancient world. And all of the accounts of slaves in the Iliad and the Odyssey are romanticized versions of slavery, much like the Gone with the Wind is a romanticized history of slavery of the South. Still, they do give us a glimpse on what it was like to be a slave in the ancient world. Our major source is the 48 lecture series from the Great Courses, not the Great Courses Plus. That includes 2 lectures on what it was like being a Greek slave and a Roman slave. And of course we had the Atlantic Magazine website for My Family Slave. That's the article from which we pulled from. Please click on the links for our blogs on slavery in the ancient world. And also please click on the links for interesting videos that will broaden your knowledge and improve your soul. Thank you.